Hi, I'm Lindsay, and this is Kinda Healthy Podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. George Schatz. He's a board-certified family medicine physician working in the Banner University Family Medicine Clinic in Tucson, Arizona. We talk about long-haul COVID from a functional perspective. Here's my conversation with George.
Hello, Lindsay.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Can you
Doing
see me?
good. Oh, now I see you.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for
Perfect.
taking the time to come and talk to me today, George.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Right.
Really excited.
So I'm really interested in the topic that we have picked out for today, long haul COVID. That wasn't even really anything that I had heard about before. Could you let people know what that is?
Absolutely, yes. Long haul COVID, there's it's kind of a colloquial term. There's a lot that goes into that. It's kind of this funny term that actually originated with a patient who had this illness, and she was from Oregon. She's actually a preschool teacher, and she had this, she said it was her lucky trucker hat, and there's actually pictures of it you can find online. It's kind of funny, but anyway, that's where that term came from, because she got sick really when all of this started around a year ago, really.
Okay.
This time last year, and sort of continued her struggle throughout all of the summer and into the fall. And so she started that Facebook group that really kicked everything off, which was called the Long Haul COVID Fighters, which sort of started our investigation into what this could possibly be. So now here we are about a year later, fast forward, and medicine, of course, takes so much longer to catch up with these sorts of things. So we're starting to really recognize this as an illness. And the medical terminology is a little different, and it's not really 100% agreed upon because it's so new and early. But there's two terms that most people are using. It's this post-acute COVID-19 syndrome, which is the one that I like. And we'll talk about what post-acute is. But there's this other one that the NIH and the CDC uses, which I'm not even going to throw out there. It's just a little different and annoying. But this post-acute is what we're starting to call this. And so post-acute means anything that's not really acute, which by definition is when you can still detect viral replication in the nose of patients. So when we do those terrible swabs that are way in the back there that people hate to do, hopefully we're not doing too many of those anymore. But when we can still detect virus on those tests, that's acute COVID. So that's usually around 3 to 4 weeks is the cutoff of when we can't really detect any more viral replication. So if you're still having symptoms by definition, then after that 3 to 4 weeks, that's post-acute COVID.
Okay. So I didn't realize that it was still showing up on tests too. I thought it was just the symptoms were prolonged and weren't going away.
Well, so that's usually what happens is once people reach that 3 to 4 week mark, they still have symptoms, but there's no longer the test. The test is negative at that point. Not always in some people. So that's why they break this up into sort of chronic COVID, which is actually 12 weeks out from the initial illness. And then the window between 3 to 4 weeks and 12 weeks is what they call this subacute COVID-19. So it's kind of annoying, but really the chronic COVID is the one that people are really mostly looking into. So that's actually 12 weeks out from when symptoms started. And if you still have symptoms, of course, by then almost everybody's viral replication is going to be 0 in the nose. So those tests are always 0. Even antibodies sometimes at that point are gone. But people are still having symptoms. And that's really where people are starting to focus their attention, because it's becoming much more widely recognized, and people are worried. They just don't really know what to think about this.
Right. And so as far as the symptoms go, it's what you would expect, right? It's the sore joints and the fatigue and all of those things. Is there anything a little different, or is it all basically it's just the same, it just keeps going?
Yeah, pain and fatigue are really the number one and number two. Fatigue's really number one. Almost all patients with this chronic COVID do have fatigue, but there could be tons of other symptoms. You could still have fevers. You could still have night sweats. You could have palpitations or chest pain. It could be more of a lung sort of distribution where you're mostly having shortness of breath, or maybe your oxygen levels are low, or maybe they're not, or you just can't exercise, or you can't stop coughing. or the neuropsychiatric symptoms are definitely something that's sort of comorbid with all of these. And the biggest one of those is this dysautonomia, where people are basically standing up and they should be able to stand up and start walking, and they're passing out, and their heart rates are going crazy, and their blood pressures are doing all these wild things, and anxiety and depression and all of that on top of it. It's really a pretty significantly wide net that these symptoms could be attributed.
Okay. What do we know about the people who are the most susceptible to this? Is there anything with what we've seen about people this seems to hit the most?
Yeah, so the people who are really, really sick, so in the ICU on ECMO, which is that heart-lung machine that bypasses the lungs and oxygenates your blood and puts it back in your body, those people with the cytokine storms and all that you hear about on the news, those people are usually the worst. They have physical damage to their lungs or their heart or their kidneys or something like that. So those people tend to have the most of these prolonged symptoms. But certainly it can absolutely be in patients who are completely asymptomatic or even very minorly symptomatic with a COVID-19 infection. There's actually this really terrifying but fascinating study of college athletes, people you'd think would be the healthiest people in the world, really, young college, almost professional athletes. And those people, so a subset of that population that had asymptomatic or minorly symptomatic COVID-19, that there was 15 to 30% of those people had changes to their heart. They had heart symptoms, and then we looked on a cardiac MRI, and they actually had inflammation in their heart. And these were people who were almost completely asymptomatic with this infection and were very healthy to start with. So that's what really scares us the most, is just something that we're not understanding about why this is hitting certain people and not others.
Is this anything we've seen before?
Yes, absolutely. So that's a good point, is that really there's nothing new under the sun, right? Post-viral fatigue syndrome has been a thing for the last 30, probably even 40 years, back into the 80s. And we've known that other coronaviruses have done this. This is definitely not something that we're completely blindsided by. But unfortunately, the syndrome that's caused, this myalgic encephalitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, or MECFS, and all the associated syndromes that really are all different heads of the same hydra, the POTS, the MCAS, this, Lyme mold SIBO group of people that seem to just, keep being kicked around the medical system that we see a lot of in our clinic. We've never in all of medicine been able to put so much emphasis on this kind of illness before. So now all of a sudden we're getting attention for this illness that we've seen for so long. And there's lots of money that the government is putting for research for this specific illness, mostly related to COVID-19, but given the symptoms of the people that we've seen for the last 30 to 40 years and the symptoms of the people that are now developing the same illness after coronavirus, we're almost certain that really it's the same illness. And so we're really excited now that all this money and all this attention is being directed to this illness that just up until this time has not been getting the amount of attention that these patients really deserve.
Oh, wow. So, so people who have contracted the virus and then are still experiencing the symptoms, and it could be the replication of the virus or not. Some people are just reacting to the remnants of it, even though it's not active.
That's exactly what we think. Yes. Okay. So it's sort of like the breadcrumbs that the virus leaves behind. So we're not really sure exactly the mechanisms of why people have their body shutting down after they get this acute viral illness, that generally those symptoms do go away. The cough, the runny nose, the fever goes away, but they're stuck with all these other symptoms. We're not quite sure 100% why that is. I have a lot of theories, and I love theories. So there's a lot that we do know, though. So we know that COVID disrupts your microbiome. We know that COVID causes acute but also prolonged inflammation. We know that people who have metabolic disturbances, diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, obesity, those kind of people do the worst with coronavirus. So we know that plays a role. We know that other infections that people may have cleared that are sort of lying dormant can become reactivated with coronavirus. There's a lot of really good case studies about EBV, which is the monovirus, becoming active in people who are actually in the ICU, and then they have to treat that virus in addition to COVID-19 and the inflammatory cascade that comes with that. So I put together, a theory that really we've had together for a long time with our ME/CFS patients, because there's a whole different subset of these ME/CFS patients. Some really definitely have viral triggers and some have other triggers. So you can't really generalize all of them and put them all in the same basket. But the ones who have a viral trigger, we're pretty certain that the immune system just never really recovers. So the innate immune system is the part that sounds the alarm. It's the watchtower that's always looking for invaders, be they virus or bacteria or fungal or God knows whatever. So for some reason, when that watchtower sounds the alarm, it just doesn't ever shut off the alarm.
Okay.
And so we think that's what causes the alarm is inflammation in the body. And so whether that's an oxidative stress or a nitrosative stress, or specifically in the endothelium, or if it's only in the lungs, whatever it is, for some reason the inflammation doesn't shut off. And each person actually could have a different type of that inflammation that goes crazy. It's really hard to nail down. And then there's this really fascinating, I guess technically it's still a theory. It's got a ton of evidence for it. That's called the cell danger response. I don't know if you've ever heard of the cell danger
I haven't.
response. It's fascinating. So this researcher, Rob, I believe is his first name, Naviaux, Naviaux. If anybody's going to Google that one, you'll never find it if you spell it phonetically. He wrote these papers on this entity. He coined the term, I believe, the cell danger response, where inflammation leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. And the mitochondrial dysfunction comes because the cell sees something dangerous, and so it goes into a dormant mode. It just turns everything down, and it just says, hey, we're going to shut all of this energy down. It's like when your phone goes into power save mode.
Right.
It's like, we don't have much battery left. We better conserve it. I don't want the screen to be super bright, right? I don't want you out there running marathons. I want you to just get through the day. So you're going to be super tired. You're not going to want to eat much. You're just going to be hanging out. And that's acutely what you feel when you have a fever, right? And you just feel like crap. You want to be in bed with the covers pulled up to your nose. That's how we feel, but that should go away. So when that doesn't go away, that's the cell danger response. And literally your mitochondria are the ones calling the shots there in that cell danger response. So we think that we get this acute infection of the virus, prolonged inflammation. That prolonged inflammation then leads to the mitochondria not working as well, not making as much energy. Your batteries are at 25% and they stay there because the body doesn't have enough energy to recharge them, but it also doesn't want to drain them all the way. So you're just stuck in this chronic fatigue situation, and the body's kind of in this vicious cycle of having inflammation that it can't get rid of. So it makes a cell danger response, which actually makes more inflammation. And so it can't get rid of it, and you can't get through that. Wow.
So how are you and the people you're working with approaching this issue when you see it?
Yeah, we do a lot of things, and our aim is to, first of all, figure out why that person's in the cell danger response in the first place. So we usually say, okay, we can tell when somebody comes in, before we even see them based on our paperwork and things, that this is going to be a cell danger response issue. And so typically we're trying to figure out, okay, why are they in that danger response? Is it a Lyme? Is it a mold? Is it a SIBO? Is it all of the above? Is it a virus? Is it all of the above? So now it makes it a little easier. So when someone comes in with a post-COVID illness, we kind of know, okay, great. They're going to be in this one bucket of the post-viral cell danger patients. And so the first thing we always do is we try to make sure that the patient is not sick or not sick. That has a different sort of connotation to people who work in the hospital. And so when you see that, you want to make sure this patient doesn't need to be in the hospital. So we usually, check their vitals and make sure that their pulse ox is okay, not both at rest, but also when they're walking, to make sure that, there's nothing hiding there that we don't know about. But when we're sure that they certainly don't need to be in the hospital anymore, then that's when we really start to think about, okay, where are they in the illness? And that gets back to that post-acute, but subacute versus chronic illness. Did they just have an illness 2 weeks ago? Are they probably still having active viral replication? Because if they are, that's a great time for us to intervene, right?
Okay.
We're going to really add people to that watchtower, right? We're going to send as many troops as we can up there so that they can just start to pick off virus as it comes across the border, or whatever it is. So basically we'll be searching for all the antiviral herbs and things like that, the furin inhibitors, the direct innate immune upregulators, so the mushroom extracts, the andrographis, the astragalus, the echinacea. I'm almost always giving NAC to everyone. I love NAC. Everybody has their different quirks about glutathione. Can you take it oral? Does it have to be liposomal or IV? And I've done a lot of research in that issue, and NAC really does a wonderful job, and it's dirt cheap for our patients. That really makes a huge difference. So I'm giving NAC just about to everyone for everything in kind of whopping dosages. So I usually start that even when they're in the active viral replication phase.
Okay.
So, but if they're out of that, past that 3 to 4 week window, if we're in that subacute window up to 12 weeks, or certainly past that, past 12 weeks, then we're probably past viral replication. Maybe if they're in that the subacute window, we'll maybe give them a few of those innate immune upregulators, maybe some mushrooms, but then we're really switching over to our NRF2 upregulators like sulforaphane and curcumin and EGCG. Really good data actually for EGCG with COVID specifically, but also a ton of other viruses.
Okay.
In addition to the NAC. And then if they're past that chronic phase, then we're really just hammering inflammation. The first step is just to really control inflammation. Sometimes though, if people have already seen some naturopaths, or they've already done a lot of work, or they're really savvy with their lifestyle and inflammation, then we can move right past that. But for the most part, or at least we can check some biomarkers and make sure they're past that before we really skip that stage.
Okay.
So that's usually step one, is really trying to see where they are, and then working, okay, do we need to kill virus? Do we need to work on inflammation? Or can we go all the way to the end, which is kind of building them back up, which is the mitochondrial rebuilding, giving all the nutrients that your mitochondria needs to work really well, like the Alcar and lots of different things, CoQ10, PQQ, NADH, D and E and A, and all of the phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, all of those phospholipids are super helpful. I love those combo supplements that really just combine all of those things. But we're kind of skipping over fundamentals here too, which is always something that we pay attention to, especially with the integrative background I have. You just can't get someone healthy without addressing sleep and stress and diet and exercise. I tell that to patients literally day in and day out. These are necessary for good health. Not sufficient though. We could have your diet squared away. You could sleep like a baby. You could have absolutely zero stress, and you could be exercising perfectly for what your body needs. You could still not be healthy, just because we haven't gone deep enough. We haven't peeled enough layers of the onion. We haven't taken care of the inflammation. We haven't rebuilt the mitochondria, or whatever else we need to do if they have something else going on. So those are always something that every patient gets an in-depth evaluation, and then a perfectly tailored prescription for lifestyle for those 4 aspects. And if we need to work on relationships and possibly trauma in the past, that's definitely something that we add in there too. Those are the big 5. Exercise is one that we should probably talk about, because it's really difficult to get people who are fatigued to exercise.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Right. It's
or even get enough rest, because sometimes you can be too tired to really rest well too, right?
Right. And honestly, a lot of the times we're not pushing exercise at all. We're actually saying to them, this is something that you'll need to pay attention to later, but certainly not right now. You just don't have enough energy.
Right.
And then usually once the inflammatory phase is up, which is a question I get a lot, is when do I know that I'm not inflamed anymore? You know, I don't want to be checking labs every 2 weeks. And I don't want to do that either. Usually it's when we start to get a change in our symptoms. And a lot of the times that's when we start to add in exercise. Okay. So you may still be fatigued, but maybe you don't have any more pain, or your brain fog is gone, or your anxiety is significantly better. You know, whatever it is, that's when we usually say, okay, it's time to get out there. It's time to start moving. And we start super, super slow. So if a person, so we try to figure out what their anaerobic threshold is, which is where your muscles start to make lactic acid. Okay. And we never cross that ever with these people. You just can't. Because if you cross that threshold, this person will crash for days, sometimes even weeks. It's terrible.
And lose all that ground that they were just trying to gain.
Exactly. So it's really, really important that you figure out where that threshold is. A lot of people that we see are in tune with their bodies. They know it. They've been doing this for a while. They know how to not do that. If it's a new illness, though, and you haven't really had the time to be able to figure that out, then that's really where some technology comes in handy. So heart rate monitors are really, really helpful. Okay. We can basically figure out what's a good heart rate to never cross, and we have people stick there. And whatever you can do to keep your heart rate up but not above that level is what we tell people to do. So if that's literally walking somewhere for 1 minute and your watch beeps, minutes up, and you turn around and walk back, and that's your 2 minutes per day, that's what we do. If you can't even do that, then we may start with some saunas. Actually, we may just get a heat lamp, and you literally stay where you are and you sit under an infrared heat lamp, and that actually is equal to exercise from a cellular standpoint, which is really nice. And that can get people started, get their heart rates up a little bit. Or maybe we'll just be doing diaphragm exercises. You know, maybe you can't walk at a minute out and a minute back because you're just so out of breath or you're coughing so much. So then we'll just literally be doing deep breathing exercise, which is the old term. Now we call it pulmonary rehab, which is kind of funny. We got to make everything sound extra fancy. Right. But really it's just deep breathing, right? You just try to exercise your diaphragm, which is a muscle. People forget that every muscle can become atrophied if we don't use it. I actually, in medical school, there was an ICU doctor who did a study looking at ultrasound at people's diaphragm thickness who are in the ICU on a ventilator. Because when you're on a ventilator, it's like,
it's doing it for you.
It does it for you, totally. So we could see people's diaphragms are this thick, and then that thick, and then that thick, and then paper thin. And they could actually tell who was going to do poorly when they would remove the ventilator based on the thickness and the perceived strength of their diaphragms. So really, really important to make sure that if you've been in the hospital for a really long time, or if you haven't been moving your body or really exercising your lungs, that we don't forget that that's a muscle too. So that's a really great way to get some exercise moving in your body going before we can actually get your whole body moving.
Right. Well, that's great that there's so many different options for the different levels of health that you can actually start doing something to start strengthening your body, even if it is just the deep breathing. Because a lot of times people focus on how much they can exercise or not and realize there's a scale that goes across there that, you might not even realize.
Totally. And that's what everybody thinks exercise is, outrunning marathons.
Right.
And exercise really starts with movement. Movement is what we just need to do to get through our day. Exercise is movement, but it's for this physiological benefit, right? It's to have bigger muscles. It's to have lower blood pressure. It's to improve circulation and all that kind of stuff. So there's a benefit with exercise. But if you can't really even move, then all movement is exercise, right? I mean, you're actually raising your threshold of what you can do just by getting around day to day. And that's still exercise in my book. So
right. Yeah, that's something for everybody to remember.
Totally. So that's the thing. And that's integrative medicine 101 is figuring out where your patient is at, where they need to be, and then how do we get them from A to B, and tailoring your recommendations to that person and their lifestyle and what's practical for them.
Right. Yeah, that's really great. is there anything that people could inadvertently do to make things worse for themselves and not even realize it? Other than, like maybe the trying to do too much exercise wise or anything like that?
That's a big one, but also something that we see all the time is how nutrition plays into these inflammatory processes. So I talk to, I come from the integrative, but also the functional side of things. And so integrative medicine and the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine has this anti-inflammatory diet, which I love and I use with a lot of patients. But in this situation, there is no one prescribed anti-inflammatory diet for everyone.
Right.
So I do have people who are saying, I eat a perfect diet. I eat, I'm not going to go into it because it's just too long, but they say, and they are. I mean, if you look on paper, this is a really healthy diet. But when you actually look into it a little bit more and you look at what their body's doing and you do an elimination diet, which in my book is the most anti-inflammatory diet you can possibly do, because what you're doing is you're taking out everything that could be inflammatory for this person, and taking away what's inflammatory is so much more beneficial to a person than adding in things that are anti-inflammatory.
Right.
It's a really important distinction that I talk with residents and students all the time. It's that apophysis, the taking away of something bad is infinitely more helpful than adding something good. So, and it's funny because they say, well, that's a rote diet too. Like, what are you talking about? That's just something you give to everybody. It's a handout. You give the same handout to everybody. And it is, but when the person comes back, that person is never on the same diet that the next person is on. Everyone's individual food intolerances are extremely unique to them. And when we cut those out, when we identify them and cut them out, inflammation drops like a stone. And so I actually just saw a patient, I think yesterday or the day before. He's having folliculitis of the scalp. He's having ringing of the ears. He's having rashes somewhere else. He's having palpitations, all these different and GI issues, and all these different inflammatory mediated symptoms. And I'm telling him, hey, I can guarantee you almost that if we cut out all these anti-inflammatory foods, these inflammatory foods, cut them out, figure out which ones are not great for you, hold them out while we fix the gut, and then add them back in later, where then you won't have that immune response. I bet you all these symptoms are going to go away.
Wow.
And we're working on it with him, but I had somebody come back actually just yesterday, and same thing happened. And they're like, oh yeah, my diarrhea of 30 years gone. I'm like,
Right.
And I'm like, okay, what was it? They're like, eggs. I'm like, would you have ever thought that? I'm like, no.
Right.
So these things, the food intolerance piece is just so essential. So what I see, to get back to your original question, is people think that they're doing a really great job. They go out and they're like, okay, I'm going to do this keto thing. I'm going to get my cottage cheese and I'm going to get my eggs and I'm going to get everything. Maybe that's not the right diet for your body. Maybe, yes, you do need low carb based on your other biomarkers and things, but you've got to go about it in a way that's really tailored to your body. And the elimination diet is the best way that I've ever figured out how to do that. There are some other tests that I'm investigating. The FIT test from KBMO is something that I'm really excited about because it's an intolerance test, but it adds complement levels, which gets rid of false negatives and false positives. So I just did I did one the other day. I'm looking forward to getting those results. So hopefully that's something that I can start using with patients, because that would make things a lot easier. But there's really no good intolerance testing. There's good allergy tests. The allergens have that squared away with patch tests and skin tests and things. But as far as these blood tests go for food intolerances, there's nothing that beats a good old-fashioned elimination diet.
Right. And a lot of times people don't really realize how bad something was making them feel until they're not having it anymore. So you can 100%. Get conditioned to just what you feel is normal, but you can feel so much better without something and not realize it. And then also I have a big problem with food plans and diets in the way that, it just gives people a list of foods that are supposed to be, what you're supposed to be having. And people are conditioned to not really question it. They're just trying to force themselves to fit this plan without ever realizing that maybe there's stuff in there that isn't for them uniquely in their systems.
Totally. Yeah. That's the one thing that I cannot stand in all of this nutrition and health and wellness field that we are in is that every single person who finds a diet that works for them then goes out and says, this is the diet every other person on the face of the earth should be eating.
Right.
And that kills me. It's like, no, not everyone needs to be paleo. No, not everyone needs to be vegan. No, not everyone needs to be low carb. Like, there are certain subsets of people that do better with these certain things. And yes, they sort of come together and they coalesce. And that's why we have all these different diet names and things like that. But until a person really goes out and experiments with these things, you're never really going to know what's best for you. And that's just the biggest problem that I have with these things. And so people come around and they're like, wait, you just told this patient to do, actually the only one that I really don't like, and I just don't think that I can ever recommend it to people, is the carnivore diet. I'm sorry to carnivore people. I'm probably going to get all these emails about it. I just don't agree that the body doesn't need vegetables and fiber, the microbiome. I'm sorry. Okay. I just had to get that out there. But
yeah, people are very strong.
They are. And I do think that one's
their diets.
They do. And that I may be wrong about that, but I just have not yet seen the data for it. And that's the thing is, we change our tack every day based on good data. And so anyway, but I recommend all these different diets that seem like polar opposites. And I get called out by residents all the time. And I'm like, yeah, it's because I don't ascribe to any specific dogma. I think that these can all be beneficial. You can do what Bruce Lee says to do, take the best from every different tradition and just leave the worst, right?
Right.
That I think is way more helpful for patients in the long run. So.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, something that may work for somebody when they first start it, maybe because of what their starting point was, right? So if they continue on with it, maybe that's not what they need in another 6 months or a year, right? It's kind of like the pH scale. You might have needed to move over, so far one way, but if you keep going with it, it could go all the way over to the other side that ends up being bad for you all over again.
Right. That pendulum is just going to keep swinging.
Right.
No, it's true. And these intolerances change. And I tell that to people all the time. And so my goal is not to cut foods away from people. I cut foods out of people's diets forever. That would be horrible. I would never be happy with that ever. My goal is just to decrease inflammation, right? And then we figure out why they have the inflammation in the first place, which 9 times out of 10 is some sort of intestinal permeability issue. That's why we're reacting to foods in the first place. It's not the immune system's fault. It's just that the immune system's seeing all these foods. That's why typically it's kind of funny. The foods that people eat the most are the ones that they're highest on these lab tests that they order, which there's a lot of reasons why that could not be a problem at all, actually, depending on the different types of IgGs. But in all intents and purposes, that means that your body's seeing the most of it, which is the problem, right? It's the problem that your gut lining looks like this when it should look like this. So when we fix that, which could take 6 weeks, it could take 6 months, generally then we can add the foods back and people are perfectly fine with them. And that's really when things are fun. When we get people back to their lives, but they're healthy again, that just is what it's all about. That gets me going every day.
So do you feel like having people understand inflammation and how it affects the body is a really good trigger to get people thinking the right way about what they're putting in their body? Maybe something
100%.
they hadn't thought about before?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's equally as important, not just for patients, but for providers to think in terms of inflammation. We should be inflammologists in this integrative and functional world. That's what we need to be thinking, and that's how we should approach patients from a clinical standpoint and figure out, okay, where is this inflammation? Why is it there?
Right.
Let's control it. Let's maybe put some water on the fire with some NaC for now and see what's going on. And maybe we need to add all these other things in to control it so that symptoms are better, so that people aren't suffering while we work on the underlying cause and we shut off the faucet, ideally. And that is an approach that I don't think we do enough of. I think medicine has been great at controlling the fires in a lot of ways. We're good at putting out fires, controlling things that are dangerous, making sure that people aren't suffering too. We're pretty good at that. But it's just that next level thought process of trying to figure out, okay, what is really going on here?
Right.
Why? And let's actually get rid of that. And then everything else falls into place. That's really where I think that functional medicine piece of that thought process is absolutely invaluable.
Right. Yeah, it takes a lot to get people to realize that listening to their body and understanding their body is an ongoing thing, that there's no certain point that you get to where, oh, now I got it. Now I don't have to worry about it anymore,
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of like, taking the red pill a little bit. Once you start to think this way about your body, ideally, hopefully, you never really lose that ability to start to think, okay, this is going to be delicious. I'll eat it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll pay for it, but I won't eat anything like this for the next week. And by the end of the week, I'll be perfectly back on my feet again.
Right.
That kind of thought process is very different from, oh, I'm going to eat this and, oh, I screwed up. Who cares what I eat now? Let me just eat whatever I want for the next 6 months until something bad happens and I get back on the wagon again.
Right.
That thought process is really detrimental.
Right. And even like you said, with somebody maybe having an intolerance for eggs, it's not even something they would have considered eliminating because they thought it was a healthy food.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's probably a big part of their diet up until this point, It's something they've eaten their entire lives. How could it be causing me to have problems? Right. And that's exactly like you said, people don't really know sometimes how poorly they feel, until they're better. I call it the windshield wiper phenomenon. You don't realize how dirty your windshield is sometimes until you clean it. And you're like, holy moly, okay, right. Wow. And I get that all the time. So sometimes I'm telling people, we should do this elimination diet. And they're like, I feel fine. I'm like, well, just humor me. And people come back and invariably they just feel so much better. And it's just really funny. I love that part of it too.
How would you recommend somebody approaching an elimination diet? Is it bad to stop too many things at once, or is it, is there anything that could be harmful or like too much of a shock to the system, or is getting rid of all the bad stuff at once just good?
It's a really difficult question to answer. We used to tell people, this is like way before my time. I say we just as posterity, but I certainly wasn't even alive when they did this. They would tell people to go back to 3 foods. So lamb, rice, and pears, 3 meals a day for 6 months.
Wow.
That was an elimination diet back when.
For 6 months?
6 months. So it's ridiculous, right? So I would never in a million years do that myself, let alone tell someone to do it. So when I'm doing these, I'm always thinking practicality first. What can this person do? What's not too hard? What is something that you can actually fit into your day when you're a busy single mom of 3 and you've got 4 mouths to feed in the house and you're going to be doing this, but nobody else is, right? Or something like that, that always trumps everything else. So if my preferred elimination diet, if I have someone who has no problems, has everything under control, has enough health literacy to know what all of these foods are and can shop and do all of this themselves, then the one that I like to do is an 8 food elimination diet. Okay. And I don't know why I have a block on this. I can never remember what all the 8 foods are, but it's definitely wheat, dairy are number 1 and number 2, corn, eggs, soy, and then I want to say it's coffee, tea, and chocolate. Sometimes citrus if the person has migraines, I'm cutting out citrus. The dietitians that I used to work with at the Cleveland Clinic always made fun of me for this, and I can't remember. Anyway, I'm sorry. They're probably, if they're listening, I'm sorry, guys. But anyway, that's about it. So it's sort of the IFM prescribed elimination diet. I love their handouts. I love that paperwork. I use that front and back sheet of the elimination diet food plan with every patient that I'm giving this to, because it doesn't focus on what you shouldn't eat. Beef is the other big one. Okay. So chicken is usually the main, chicken and fish are the 2 proteins that people are eating on the elimination diet. I love that handout because it focuses on what you should be eating, not what you should not be eating. So if you tell someone, don't eat dairy, gluten, and eggs, they're going to say,
Well, that's
oh
all
my
I
God,
ever
I
eat.
can't,
That's all I
exactly
ever
right.
want.
It's like, well, I can't have omelets and I can't have cake and I can't have,
Right.
you know, instead of thinking, oh, well, I can have a chicken Caesar salad or like something like that, you know? So focusing on what you can eat as opposed to what you can't eat makes all the psychological difference in the world. And so I have patients who are, that they do not have a lot of money. They do not have a lot of means. They do not have a lot of time, but I give them this one form and they come back 30 days later and they've stuck to it 100%. And they're like, yeah, it really wasn't that bad. And it blows my mind. And I have residents here. We're the clinic I'm currently at is 80 to 90% Medicare and Medicaid. And so residents here are like, you're never going to get people to do an elimination diet. Give it a shot.
Right.
And I swear I've only had one person really just not be able to do it. And that was for other reasons. And so that's where the practicality aspect comes in. So I'm mad at myself for giving the person that one in the beginning, because I should have been able to pick up on something that would have made this unsuccessful for that person.
Okay.
And in those times when we can't do 8 foods, then I'm like, okay, can we just do dairy? Looks like you're not eating that much dairy to begin with. Maybe a little bit here and there. Let's try to just switch that heavy cream that you put into your coffee into coconut cream from a can, you know, something easy like that. And that's really where sort of the rubber meets the road. And having dietitian support for that is just so helpful. They just, I mean, I can't tell you how much that makes these things sort of successful. But that's really my approach to elimination diets. It's practicality first. And then we try to cut out that elimination diet from the IFM, that top 8 food allergy one, it cuts those 8 foods out because those are the most likely to cause inflammation in people.
Okay.
So we don't have to cut everything out. We just cut off the really big offenders. And once those are out, generally people's inflammation almost always drops significantly. And so I only do it for about 4 weeks. I tell people 30 days, give me just 30 days, and then we'll start to reintroduce foods.
Okay.
And that careful reintroduction is actually more important than the elimination, to be perfectly honest. Adding in one food at a time every 3 days without eating like pizza, which has dairy and corn and soy and gluten and all that stuff, you know.
Right.
And so if you react, you don't know which one it was. But adding one of those foods in at a time, slowly, methodically, will tell you whether it was just eggs that caused you to have issues, or was it actually the dairy or something that, you know, if you would have just eaten cake that's got dairy, it's got eggs, you don't really know.
Right.
So that part is even more actually important than the elimination in the first place.
Right. And that seems like that would be a really good way for it to click with people too. You know, that things actually cause reactions in them instead of saying, just cut this food off. You know, I don't think you should eat this food type of thing, you know, the reintroducing of it, and then they can feel for themselves and see for themselves. And it's not really somebody just telling them what not to do.
Right. Exactly. And I tell people, you know, my goal is for you to actually add all of these back and be perfectly fine.
Right.
Most of the time, 70, 80, 90% of the time, that doesn't happen. And people have some sort of reaction to 1 or 2 foods. And then we just hold those out for then a couple of months while we're healing up the gut, which I mentioned, and then we can add them back in. But I think people knowing that my goal is not to cut these things out long term. The goal is not to be as restrictive as possible. It's to actually be as liberal as possible, to broaden your diet as much as possible. Right. I think having that goal in mind really changes the outlook for the elimination diet. And that's why I've had so much success for it. I hope.
Yeah, and I would think that would be really good for people to know too, that it wasn't about getting rid of something long term, you know, that it's just to see how they react to certain things. And I mean, how often do you see that people figure out something that they're having a reaction to, but it's really not something they're willing to give up?
Oh, very rarely. You'd be really surprised.
Oh, that's
good. Yeah, I mean, I that lady I just saw with eggs, she's like, you know, I really loved eggs, but like, I don't eat them. I feel so much better. And that's that thing. I mean, people just, when you finally see how clear the windshield can be, like, why would you go out and squirt some mud on it? I mean, most people just really don't see the benefit of eating those foods, or any sort of benefit to them. You know, people with celiac disease, true celiac disease, that have, you know, not that people who don't have acute GI illnesses or symptoms don't have true celiac disease, but those who are really fortunate enough to have that acute diarrhea, basically, from eating gluten, those are the people who will never touch another morsel of gluten in their entire lives, because they just know that it's not going to end well for them.
Right.
You know? And so when we can sort of generalize that to other things, and people really know, hey, you know, if I eat this, I'm going to get a migraine. And that's the other piece is, I don't have too many people that just eat it willy-nilly or eat these things willy-nilly, but I do have people, and I am totally okay with this. I actually even tell people that, you know, this is how they should live their lives, especially when we get to a time where we've healed up the gut, but there's just so much immune recognition of that food that the immune response doesn't really decrease enough. You know, some people, unfortunately, it's not the majority, it's the small minority, but some people, if they eat eggs every time in their life, they're going to have the same immune response. But those people, you know, we say, don't avoid eggs forever. You know, you may get a migraine, it may last for 3 days, but at least you know it's only going to be 3 days. And at least you know what to do, and we'll give them all these things to do to prevent it, to decrease the severity and all of that kind of stuff. But live your life. You know, if you're at a party and there's deviled eggs and you haven't had a deviled egg in 20 years and that just looks amazing, go ahead and eat it. You know, we'll take care of all of the repercussions of that. We'll make sure the inflammation doesn't go crazy, but live your life. You know, that's first and foremost.
I would imagine it is nice to know what triggers it too.
Totally.
You know?
And that control piece is so important. Yes, exactly. That really is the most important thing, is now you know exactly what is causing this. And so it completely changes everything about the illness. You know, there's no surprises. It's you're not living your life dictated by your migraines. You are able to live your life, and you're in control of your migraines. And actually, for people with migraines, that's a huge problem, because it's kind of you know, psychologically they could hit at any moment, right? And you could be in the middle of nowhere and have nothing with you that you would normally do to help prevent them, and they could come out. And I mean, that just living under that sort of that dread, that fear, can really be worse than the actual illness itself in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Actually, I have a friend of mine who has really bad migraines, and she's been doing the Botox shots around her head.
Fascinating, right?
Yeah. She's getting ready to do her third round, and she's hoping that one will make a kick in for her. So far, she's still been having them. But I wonder what else she's been looking at to get rid of.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I heard from Mark Hyman years ago, and Elimination Diet, including citrus for migraines, the very first thing you do. And I just have had so much success with that as well.
That's so crazy. What is it about citrus?
I don't know. It's I've never been able to figure that out. It's really weird. And some people are perfectly fine with it, but there's just almost no one for other illnesses has a problem with citrus. But for some reason, there's a sizable amount of people with migraines, like 30-40%, that have a problem with citrus. And I don't know what it is. It's a good question.
Wow. Yeah, man, summer must be like a really scary time of year.
I know, right?
Think of lemons and
right. And in Tucson, I mean, you could literally walk down the street and pull them off of people's trees. It's got to be terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, and then what you were saying also about the elimination diet, I feel like people can have such a habit around foods that doing that would really help them to even realize the alternatives they could be having, rather than those foods that may be triggering them and they don't even know.
Right. Or just you're set in your ways. You know, food is so much more than just calories and you know, chemistry. It's so much more than information to the body. We talk about food being information, but it's so much more than that. Right. And it's so much more than this, you know, social interaction piece and a cultural piece. You know, food is just something that is something we don't think twice about. You know, you just kind of like eat, but there's all these different levels to it. So pulling someone out of their habits,
Right.
food, making them think differently about food in general is something that 90% of people in America today have never done
Right.
and never will do. So that's why I say everyone in America, and I believe this, everyone in America should do one of these elimination diets at least just once in their lifetime. Give me a good 30 days of completely thinking about food differently. And I guarantee you it will make you have a better relationship with food as you move forward, even if you found no inflammatory triggers whatsoever. It's just a helpful exercise. But also, people, actually, I forget. I said 90% of people have problems with food. I forget what B was going to be. It's probably not important. But it's really a helpful exercise for people. And that's why, if there's one thing I can do with a patient, well, if there's one thing, it's probably get them to sleep better. It's probably the most important. But number 2, close to, is an elimination diet.
Yeah, that would be really interesting if more people would try that out as just something just to see, if things feel better and, they find a unknown trigger to some of their symptoms. I don't think I've ever done it. I should probably try it too. I know there's been lots of times where, because people can come up with theories about things too, what they think is bothering them,
Totally.
and they don't actually know.
Yeah. Or you go and you do some expensive test that gives you all these IgGs of what you are food intolerant of, or what you're reacting to. And 95% of those are false positives or false negatives. Those tests are just not helpful whatsoever. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to name any of the
like the things you see ads for,
tests,
like
I know, that are everywhere. I know. And I had patients who do them, and the ones that are really high, there's probably something there, but all these other ones, they're just really not all that helpful. So, what I always do with people is we just test those clinically, right? We say, okay, you have these 10 high foods. We're going to cut out these 5 and then see how you feel. And then we'll cut out the next 5 and, work through those. But you have to test those in real time in your body, or else it's just not helpful. So sometimes with kids, I do some of those IgG food panels because it helps me to tailor recommendations of elimination diets. Trying to do an 8-food elimination diet in a kid is really tough. If the whole family's doing it, that's one thing, but even if they go to school, and if you eat one of those foods, right, you're trying to get your antibodies down to a sizable level. So they have a 21-day half-life. So if you go from 100% on those antibodies to 50% in 3 weeks, you're going to notice a difference in your symptoms.
Right.
Cutting your inflammation in half is going to cut your symptoms by 5-fold. But with a kid, right, so if you eat any of those foods in that time frame, your inflammation jumps right back up to 100%. So you could be down to 77% already, halfway there or so, and then boom, you pop right back up to 100. So if a kid goes to school and trades a sandwich with somebody and gets a whole big dose of gluten or whatever,
right,
they could be done for. So it can be really helpful in kids to just find one food that's the main culprit and then eliminate that and just work on that one at a time. So those are the times when I do some of those tests. But that's why I'm really excited about some of these other tests that add this other level of immune marker on top, which can weed out all the false negatives and false positives. So I've constantly been looking for one of those tests, and I'm hoping that I found one pretty soon.
Oh yeah, that would be good. So yeah, I liked how you said that trying the elimination diet too can help show people that eating healthy doesn't have to be expensive too.
Totally.
Because that can be a misconception that a lot of people have.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know if anybody, any of your listeners have found this in the past, but I kind of really dove into this in med school because I was trying to wrap my head around this. I was not having a lot of means myself, being a poor student and trying to eat healthy. And there's some really good information on, I think it's $4 a day or $4 a week even. I can't remember exactly. It's been too long, but there's people online who have gone a full 30 days with a certain amount of money, and they've eaten an extremely great amount of food, adequate calories, adequate nutrients from a micro and macro standpoint.
Right.
And they've done so for very little money. And so we usually give people here, we have a really great food bank in Tucson. And so the food bank, I mean, we can grow food basically year round.
Right.
And we can get a lot of really great produce in people's hands. So that's why I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, because I have different resources now to get people food who need food here
Right.
in our local system.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. In the past, I've seen people who said that they were going vegan or vegetarian. I'm not sure which, but they were eating cheese fries and Oreos because
Technically
they're
vegan.
vegetarian or something.
Totally right.
I was just like, you don't
Cheese
see that that's not good.
Yeah, right. It's totally true, right? You can do that with any diet too. You can do that with paleo or keto. Oh, that's the worst thing. It's like the bacon. We used to call it dirty keto at Cleveland Clinic,
right?
Where people would be eating cottage cheese and butter and bacon, and all of it is from conventional cows, and it's just terrible on just about every biomarker we have. And it's kind of funny, we do these group visits and you'd see people come back and you'd be like, yay, everything's better, and then you'd see somebody and be like, ooh, everything's worse. Like, but I'm keto, like I got my ketones, I'll prove it to you. And you're like,
I'll prove it to you.
and I'm usually like, okay, Ryan, come on over here and help us out, because I need help. That's one of our dietitians. And so you can tell, and it's just, there's a right way to do any sort of diet, right? And that's why people give these fad diets a bad name, especially people in my profession that speak very disparagingly about every single type of diet, because they just say that in their minds everybody's doing them in that sort of wrong way that we're talking about. You can do that with every diet, but you can certainly also do every single diet in an extremely healthy way, including probably carnivore. I just haven't figured out how to do it yet, or in who. But anyway, I can hear the emails, Craig. So many people burning down my door. I see people.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that's something that people have to realize too, that if something's for them, it doesn't mean it has to be for everybody else too, right?
That's exactly right. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's for everybody else. And that's, I just can't stand that. It's like the ring, right? It's like the Lord of the Rings, like one ring to rule them all, like one diet to rule them all. Everybody is like in this constant battle. Like I'm not trying not to name names, but like you can all be correct. There's a certain subset of the population that does extremely well with your specific diet, and you happen to be part of that. So just preach to those people and forget everybody else. Because everybody else is going to self-select into some other group as well, and they don't need to be fighting against you. You know, it's just nobody needs that.
Yeah, I mean, our systems are so personal. I don't know why everybody likes to think that they're unique and special sometimes, but then other times they want to be just like everybody else, and it doesn't really work that way.
It's very true. I mean, and that's the only really way to do it. It's the only way to figure out which of those diets fits with your body is to try them. Mm-hmm. So like I don't laugh, but you know, I think everybody should have a vegan phase, right? You go through this time where you're like, you know, a teenager and you're going to save the world, and you got to get out there and make sure that, you know, what you're not contributing to anything bad. And some people continue with that the rest of their lives because they nailed it. They got lucky that that's the perfect diet for them, and they'll be vegan until they're like 90. And they'll be like vigorous until the day they die. I've seen it. It's wonderful. But a lot of people get worse, you know, especially people on the autoimmune spectrum. They're eating all these lectins. I mean, that's just not going to go well. They're going to have this huge leaky gut aspect, and they're just going to feel horrible. They're going to be deficient, and they're going to have a lot of inflammation. And so usually those people on that autoimmune spectrum do much better on the paleo style, you know, lower grain or no grain, really lower grains, and higher in vegetables and meat, really.
Yeah.
And every single one, right? We're talking about, you know, overall patterns, but then you got to dial in, well, macronutrients, like, are you genetically predisposed to being a little more insulin resistant? Do you need lower carbs? Do you not? You know, are you more active, and are you like an uber athlete triathlon I was going to say runner, but you're doing other things, triathlete, I guess is the term. And you need more carbs in those situations.
Right.
Things
Right.
like that. It's way too hard to say this person should eat this, or that all people should eat this diet.
Right. Would you say that people's biggest issue is chronic inflammation?
Yeah. I think that is a true statement. Now, what that statement actually means, though, is really, really difficult to nail down. Saying inflammation, specifically chronic inflammation, but just saying inflammation is like saying European economics. It's like, okay, well, what city, what country, what time period, what currency, what are we talking about here?
Okay.
And that part is where the devil is, it's in those details of figuring out what part of that person's Europe is not doing well from an economical standpoint, and trying to bolster that and build on what is doing well in their body, and trying to use that resilience, that energy, to then go into these parts that are not doing very well and trying to remedy those. So that's really what we do day in and day out.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Now I don't know what to say.
Right. It's just too much to comprehend a lot of times. So that's why we break things down into easy steps. The last thing I want is to be done with a patient and have them come out of the room and be like, what? Which, I'm sure happens. We just are going over so many different things. So that's why coming back to those 5 lifestyle factors, the diet, sleep, stress, exercise, relationships, and I put trauma in there just because trauma is really at the root of a lot of people's illnesses. I could probably talk to you for another hour all on trauma and how that changes the brain literally, and that changes the body figuratively.
And I'm sure that's something that most people don't think about even considering with their health, right?
Totally. Yeah, that is the most prevalent and underdiagnosed root cause of people's illnesses. We're always talking about root causes. That is a huge one. Actually heard recently, so WHO said 75 to 80% of people in the world have suffered a major trauma in their lifetime. Actually, no, I think they said have PTSD, but that's very different from suffering a major trauma and having PTSD. I forget exactly what they said, but either way, that's really significant. And we don't talk about, it's hard to talk about, it's hard to bring up, but that's getting into the weeds a little bit. But we always put together, right? So if somebody suffered a big trauma, we're going to talk about that. We're going to put a plan together specifically to address that. We're going to lay out the specifics for that. If their diet is great and they've already done elimination diets, then great, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to focus on sleep or exercise or stress, whatever it is. So starting slow, building momentum with some of those small lifestyle changes while we're also investigating for the root causes is just good medicine. That's not even good integrative or functional medicine. That should just be and will be in the next 20, hopefully it's not 50 years, but Western medicine will come around. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Naturopaths have been doing this forever, and they're still around. They wouldn't have been. They would not be still around, given, how much weight our Western medical society has. They would not be still around if there wasn't something to what they do. If the truth wasn't there, if the proof wasn't in the pudding. So I hold on to that pretty dearly when things are tough. I'm like, okay, well, we'll be fine. This medicine works and it will stand the test of time. So
I mean, and that is just like a cliched complaint that people have too, is that their doctor doesn't ask them anything about them, and they just come in, do this or that, and leave, and the nurse deals with them mostly, and
totally.
So
and it's a product of the system, and systems take a long time to change, but everyone in that system, every physician in that system and everyone in the administration really does want the best for people. I know it's really easy to sort of slip into that conspiracy theory mindset, which I absolutely ascribe to. I take part in. heavily in a lot of ways, but having the training that I've had and the experiences that I've had, I'm 100% certain that everyone who's calling the shots really has an individual's best in their mindset. I mean, they're really looking out for their best interests, and that certainly is all we need to better the system. It'll take a long time and there's a ton of bureaucracy, but that's really all we need is the desire to improve things and to make it better for the individual, which is there. So that I have a lot of hope in that concept.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess a new subject or a new topic is this might be kind of out of left field, but something that people are starting to deal with now is the vaccines also, right? So as far as people with the long haul COVID symptom things, what have you seen about people reacting to the vaccine with having that? Have you heard anything about that?
I've heard some things, and I have not had enough clinical experience with that to really be able to comment. I don't like to comment on sort of things that I've heard from other people that I can't really verify, unless it's sort of been published and vetted from that standpoint. But what I have noticed is that people who have strong immune systems feel like crap when they get the shots. Whether it's usually the second, almost always the second, sometimes the first as well. But people who have strong immune systems are going to get 24 hours of fevers, chills, feeling like junk.
Oh, wow.
Maybe muscle aches, that kind of stuff. People who may not have the strongest immune systems tend to actually do really fine with the shots and absolutely no symptoms. They skirt right past and no problems, and certainly no worsening of any sort of immune issues they may have had prior to this. So people on that autoimmune spectrum that I was talking about, people who are elderly, people who have other problems with their, their immune system, they actually do really fine with the shots, and they cruise right through, really no problems. So I wasn't expecting to see that in people, but that's certainly what I've seen so far.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I was just wondering because everybody's getting access to it so good now that, I was wondering about how people who already have kind of, like things going on inside with it, that how adding a little bit more of something, how that would kind of trigger them too.
Right. So people who've had COVID before or something like that. Right. So I've heard some things and I've seen some of these where people have had COVID and they get the shot and they have sort of that same pretty pronounced immune response that I was mentioning. I have not yet had anyone with a post-acute or chronic COVID-19 then go and get the shot. I just haven't had any of those patients yet. It just hasn't really come up because we've been doing other things. And, so I can't really comment on that, but it's a really good question. It's a really good thought. And I'm curious to see how that does play out in the future here. Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add, George?
Not so much. I mean, if people are in the Tucson area and they'd love to come on by, we unfortunately can't do telemedicine outside of the state of Arizona, but but we can do telemedicine within the state of Arizona. But if anybody is here in the Tucson area and wants to come by, we're creating a COVID long haul clinic at the University of Arizona, the Banner University Medical Center. And so that'll be something that if people have these issues and whether they were confirmed COVID or not, we'd love to see them and we'd love to see what we could do for them.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with me tonight and going over so many topics, honestly. I feel like we've been on like every topic we could possibly be on. But I think you made some really great points and some really good things for people to think about how they approach just their everyday life and maybe thinking about, paying more attention and, not being on the kind of automatic thinking with everything and giving themselves a chance to kind of get out of their habits and see how things work out for them.
Absolutely. Yes. And thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this talk and Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Schatz is moved by addressing the root causes of disease so that you can get back to doing what moves you. If you'd like to get in touch or find out more, go to georgeschatz.com. The link will be in the description. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.